So, dear colleagues, I would like to talk about a subject that is not very much on our minds right now, given the lockdown that we're in. It's mass tourism. I will speak about mass tourism in general, and then I will make specific reference to something that is known as overtourism. Once upon a time, being a tourist was very easy. We used to go somewhere, we didn't necessarily go to destinations that were terribly overcrowded. It was all a bit more fun than it used to be. And at the end of the day, I think Greta Thunberg is quite right. We are killing the planet with our behavior, our selfish behavior as tourists. And I'm sure you've all been in situations on holiday where you have found to be in the presence of too many people. So overcrowding is definitely becoming a problem. To illustrate what this is like and what this means, I would like to invite you to come on a journey with me. Let's travel to Rome on a beautiful autumn day. It's very warm. You're trying to get to the Trevi Fountain, but there are thousands of people around you with selfie sticks trying to get that brilliant, perfect, Instagrammable photograph of themselves and their girlfriends, boyfriends, and of course this beautiful marble fountain. There are video cameras, there's children, there are suitcases. It is simply too full. So you're trying to elbow your way through the masses just so that you can see the water, and once you get to the edge of the water, you fall over a police barrier that has been erected to stop the tourists from falling into the water. Just half a mile away, we have a very similar picture just outside St. Peter's Basilica, where there's a queue of people snaking twice around the square. It's 500 meters long, and people are waiting for 3 or 4 hours in the sun just to get inside for a few minutes. Now, if you are one of these people, you're probably feeling like a bit of an idiot, because you could wait in a queue for hours at home as well. You don't have to go to a foreign country and spend money to do that anymore. So tourism has become really an illusion. It no longer delivers what it promises. And queuing is not really the worst thing about mass tourism either. I mean, you could just avoid the problem and stay at home. I think there are two worse problems about this. For instance, the fact that mass tourism is dirty. Previously, we used to think that tourism was responsible for between 3 and 4% of global CO2 emissions. Recent studies, however, have shown that it's more likely to be in the region of 8 to 10% of global CO2 emissions. And this is mainly to do with people taking flights, increasingly cheap flights, and also cruises. We all know about the environmental impact of cruise ships. I don't want to go into that just now. So that's one of the worst problems that I recognize with this, but there's another one as well. It's the fact that local infrastructures are simply not built for these masses of tourists that are coming in, and so they are being overstretched. I could give you a few examples here. For instance, Dubrovnik, Barcelona, the island of Majorca, Amsterdam, or even Berlin. The list goes on and on. So that's mass tourism, and that's one problem. And one step up from that is something that is known as overtourism. How is overtourism defined? It's defined as a situation where tourists no longer use the services that have been designed for locals, but when locals are forced to use the services that have been designed for tourists. That's maybe a little bit difficult to explain, but I'll try and give you an example. For instance, a traditional pub that is squeezed out by a trendy bar or restaurant, or local services such as cobblers or a dry cleaner or a hairdressing shop that is forced to move out because the rents have become too expensive, and they're replaced by a souvenir shop, or maybe 3. It's not unusual to see 3 or 4 souvenir shops in the same street in some towns anymore. A final example is if rental apartments are no longer available to the local population. Instead, the locals have to go on Airbnb and rent living space for a lot of money, if they can get an apartment at all. This kind of tourism, over-tourism, is an industry that promotes exploitation and pollution. And it's not something that anyone would ever consider viable. Now, humans will never voluntarily stop traveling. You can't tell people to stay at home. So what can we do to create a sustainable and viable form of tourism, one that is kind to the planet and to everyone else around us? Well, history has shown that there are ways to stop tourism in its tracks from one day to the next. You might all remember the eruption of the Icelandic volcano Eyjafjallajökull, which released a huge ash cloud into the atmosphere, and travel, aviation notably in the northern hemisphere, was interrupted for weeks. And of course, a very current example is the coronavirus crisis, which has led to a complete shutdown on travel and tourism for weeks, possibly months, we do not know. So these short, sharp shocks are something that can help to shut down tourism completely, but I think you all agree that it is neither desirable nor sustainable to try to do that. Also, let's not forget the economic factor of tourism, because tourism is an industry that provides millions of people with a livelihood. Now, at this part of the debate, whenever we talk about these things, the term sustainability is normally used. Sustainability in tourism is not very well defined, and to my knowledge, there haven't really been any real and effective solutions to this problem so far. Maybe we need to place our hopes in the younger generation. They have greater awareness, I think, than we do maybe, or our parents' generation, of the ecological and social aspects of traveling and of tourism. They typically want more genuine, more personal experiences when they go traveling. For instance, you could think of couchsurfing, which is something you might be familiar with. You go online, you look for locals in the city that you want to visit, you stay with them for a couple of days, and you get to know their way of life. The impact on the infrastructure is actually very small to non-existent. Even the Chinese tourism industry is starting to move away from the old popular structures that they used to have. 10 cities in 10 days. These kinds of itineraries are becoming very rare, and that's a good thing. Some destinations have actually taken action themselves, locally, limiting the number of visitors to their towns, for instance. Dubrovnik in Croatia is a very popular destination for cruise ships. On some days, there are 15 big cruise ships anchored off the coast, with thousands of passengers disembarking to visit the old town. I'm just using the present tense here, but in fact, the town council has taken action, and they are now limiting the number of people who can enter the old town to 6,000 tourists. The tourists are counted by way of a camera, which is able to count individuals coming in and out. And if that limit is reached, the doors are closed and you have to wait outside until a group comes out, and then you can go in. Or take the Galapagos Islands, for instance. Groups can be 10 people or less, that's it. No bigger groups are allowed, and you're only allowed to spend 4 nights per stay on the island to avoid overcrowding. Barcelona is another case in point. The city council has decreed that there will be no new hotels built in the city centre, only on the periphery of town. And finally, in Rome, you no longer can sit on the famous Spanish steps to eat your lunchtime panino. If you sit down, the police will be there straight away, they will blow a whistle, and you have to move on. Other types of holiday have become more popular lately, camping holidays, although today you would probably rather refer to them as glamping holidays. Retreats to spiritual places like monasteries, or walking holidays, pilgrimages, that kind of thing. These are the kinds of holidays that already carry a fair tourism label. And I think one way to combat the problem is to think about an unfair tourist label as well. Or maybe one could impose a personal CO2 limit. Once you've reached your limit for the year, you're no longer allowed to take a personal flight. I agree it would be difficult to enforce, but maybe people could be made to feel bad if they decide to fly from Europe to New York for a weekend's shopping, for instance. That might help a little bit. Now, meanwhile, of course, none of us can travel at all. We don't know how long this will continue, so we might as well take this time to reflect profoundly on our next trip, on our next holiday, and look for a decision or a destination that is truly sustainable, one that Greta Thunberg would agree with if she were interested. Maybe we shouldn't stay at home for our next holiday. I think we've all had enough of that right now. But we could stay inside our own country. We could go for more unlikely destinations, go off the beaten track, which is something you should do anyway. From personal experience, I know that it can be very worthwhile not to get off the train where everyone else gets off. Maybe you could just continue on for a couple of other stops, and you will come to a place that is probably just as beautiful, but you would not be surrounded by hundreds or thousands of people. Thank you very much.